The famous psychologist, Dr. Viktor Frankl, once said, "It does not matter what we expect from life. It is what life expects from us." We need not go around searching for the meaning of life. Life will search us and question what we are made of. How true. So in these two sessions, and these two sessions will be back to back, in this one we're going to talk about some things that we can do to make a difference in who we are when life questions us to see what we're made of. And then in the second session, we're going to look at it from a different perspective, because there is a perspective from which we come, that we're not a blank slate. We come sort of pre-programmed for how we're going to respond. And we're going to talk about that and then put these two together. So it kind of takes both sessions to make the whole picture. But I hope that this is going to be something meaningful for you. And there are a few little points that I'm going to be making that maybe you might want to, if you have a pen and paper, just to take down a few of those ideas and work on them, because we don't make changes in who we are without some work. It's sort of an exercise program. And you know how we are about exercise programs, don't you? We start out all fired up, but the first thing we know, we're not doing it. So the reason I like you to have a little something on paper is that you maybe will remember that once you intended to do that, and try to be a little more determined to stay with it. You know, this probably may not be a session that necessarily makes you feel better. I hope it is a session that helps you to think better. That's what we're really going to try to do in these sessions. You know, when we talk about loss and change and especially unwanted change, you know, we tend to think, I guess, about the death of a loved one, and yet there are many, many kinds of losses that we face in life. It's not just the death of a loved one, although that's one of the significant ones. I read a book some years ago, and I don't even remember the author's name, but it was called Necessary Losses. And the point that they were making was that even from your infancy, you're enduring losses. Now think of this. From the time that we are an infant, one of the first things that happens is that a baby is weaned. Now there is a loss and an unwanted change, probably. So you can see the difference that a loss begins to make early on in our lives. And it just keeps on. You know, after a child has been in the home in its younger years, all at once they're packed up and sent off to the jungle of school life. And talk about change. There are all those other children out there who don't really know that everything's supposed to go his way. And there's that teacher who expects something of him. Life has changed, and that's a significant loss. So you begin to see what that author was talking about when she said necessary losses that go on from the earliest days onward. So we experience loss after loss after loss. And, you know, as we go through school, there are all kinds of changes and influences that come our way as we experience those changes. But the truth of the matter is, most of us are pretty uncomfortable with change. If we really got to vote on the matter, we probably wouldn't have nearly so many changes, because we really don't like them very much. What do you think it is about change that threatens us so much?
The unknown.
The unknown, you got it. That's exactly right. We have sort of an innate fear of the unknown. We don't know whether we can do this or not and what that's going to mean for our lives. And so we are uncomfortable with that change. Another thing that makes us uncomfortable with it is that we like to think that we are in control of our circumstances. We're not, but we like to think that we are in control. And when things have gone along in our little routine and in a fairly structured way, and then suddenly something changes that, we feel out of control. And we feel uncomfortable. You know, we know how to do the routine. We know that really well. We know how to get up in the morning and get a cup of coffee and go out and get the newspaper and do those things that we know how to do. And we're comfortable with that. We don't like that to change. But if something does happen to change that nice, comfortable routine that we try to make for ourselves and be comfortable with, then we don't like it. We don't. We're uncomfortable with it. And we get used to living in the same place, living with the same mate. We get used to enjoying the same friends and going to the same store and the same beauty shop. We get used to that, and we want to stay just that way. And if it doesn't, we start scratching for normal again, because we want normal in our lives. But at any moment, normal can be taken away. And there will be nothing that we can do about it. And that's called unwanted change. You know, we can handle those changes that are wanted. Those, if somebody suddenly decides to give me a Mercedes, I probably can handle that change. But these changes that we don't want, we don't handle those quite so well. You know, it can just be some little simple thing like your hairstylist decides to retire. You can hope that's the only unwanted change that you have. But of course, in these times of economic downturn, it's quite possible that the breadwinner may lose his job or her job. And that's a little more substantial loss than just losing your hairdresser. And we will have to make some changes probably if that happens. We'll have to change the way we do things. We have to throw out the budget and start over. We'll have to sacrifice some things that we had always had and we won't have right now. And we don't like that. That doesn't feel good. And that's unwanted change. But those changes are reversible. Sometimes those things just go on for a while and then we get the job back and get another hairdresser and all of those things. Those are reversible changes. We can get back from those. But then sometimes in life, and we will probably all eventually be confronted with irreversible changes. That's one that changes and there's nothing you can do about it and it's not ever going to be the same again. And actually that is my story. Some of you already know my story, but just briefly I will tell you that I was one of those people who had a nice routine of life going, really pretty smooth sailing, and didn't know really what it was to have an irreversible change in my life. And my husband and I went out for dinner one evening and came home, and as we drove into our driveway and into the garage, I exited my side of the car to be grabbed around the neck by a robber. He put a very ominous-looking weapon right in my face. Now, I don't know if you've ever looked down the barrel of a gun, but it was a lot like standing on the precipice. He demanded my jewelry, so I gave it to him, and he pushed me out onto the driveway, and about that time the clip fell from his weapon and bullets fell everywhere, and my husband was just coming around the car from his side of the car, and he turned and shot my husband in the head right before my very eyes. So in a matter of seconds, my life was dramatically changed forever. You know, I wound up in just a matter of minutes at the trauma unit at Parkland Hospital, which is where President John Kennedy was taken when he was assassinated. My husband technically lived a few more hours but never regained consciousness. So my life would never go back to that normal, routine way of life again. And not only that, but immediately I was embroiled in a media frenzy because our city of Dallas, where I live, had 22 driveway robberies. And ours was the first in which someone had been murdered. And about a week later, someone else was murdered and in the broad open daylight in his driveway. And then in a couple of weeks after that, my own life was threatened, and a female police officer moved into the bedroom next to mine and stayed there for 3 months, giving me protection. So you can see what a bizarre change my life took. And it took it such a long time to even allow me to wonder what life was going to be like after that, because for an entire year, we were dealing with that case, and once they arrested the shooter, then we had to turn the case over to the district attorney's office, and the investigation started all over again. So 1 year to the day of my husband's death, we were in trial. So that was what a long space of time it was before I could really even confront the grief process, which we'll probably going to talk about that some in that second session. So life can get pretty stormy, and when it does, we can feel pretty overwhelmed and certainly helpless during a time like that. So what I want us to do right now is think for a minute about some ways that we don't want to think during a time like that. Or during a time when you've lost your job or had health problems or whatever it is. One of the things that nearly all of us tend to do when we are in a situation like that is that we begin immediately trying to look far ahead down the road and imagine what things are going to happen to us because of this, don't we? And it never looks good. It always looks bleak when we imagine like that. So what we're doing is borrowing trouble from tomorrow. And it's not getting us anywhere. We're just bringing ourselves unnecessary suffering when we do that. And yet we certainly have that tendency to do it. It is one of the most common responses when we find ourselves in a painful situation. Now, the best thing for us to do in that situation to have a more peaceful transition is to try to just take each day as it comes and live that day. Just live that day. And don't borrow for tomorrow. We're not even promised tomorrow. And we certainly can't imagine what tomorrow is going to be like. We do know from statistics that a large portion of what we worry about never happens. So see what a waste of time it is for us to spend trying to figure it out. We should learn from that story of the Israelites in the Old Testament. When they were in the wilderness and they began to see that they were running out of food, and they were mumbling and grumbling about that. And what's going to happen? They're looking down the road and they're seeing starvation. And God rescues them. He starts giving them manna. But do you realize how he gave that manna to them? 1 day at a time. He didn't let them gather more manna than they could use in 1 day. And if they did, it rotted before morning. He was insisting that they trust him with their circumstances 1 day at a time. That's the lesson we want to learn from that story. We should not be looking far down the road trying to imagine what's going to happen. It'll always look bad to us if we do. So, as we consider the impact of change and loss upon us personally, let's just think of some things that might make that transition a little more peaceful. Whether it's a health problem or a job loss or the loss of a loved one or financial reversals or whatever it is, there are some things that you and I can do before the storm to help us have a different personality in the storm. I am a big believer in that. That's why I said I wanted you to write these down, because it's well worth working on. I'll tell you, some of these points were immeasurable help to me. So one of the things we want to do is resolve in our hearts right now that no matter what happens to us, we will not allow ourselves to become resentful. You know, there's nothing worse than to become angry and bitter and resentful, feeling it so unfair what has happened to us. It will destroy our lives and the lives of those with whom we have relationships if we do that. You know, I have this story about a young fellow who wanted to be a preacher, and he started stuttering. And he was just so angry. He went to doctors and therapists and everybody he could think of and tried to get over that stuttering, but he couldn't. He was angry at God. He was so resentful. He went to his minister and he was just raving forth. And that minister said to him, "What if God came into this room and told you that he has just one thing he wants you to do with your life? What would you say?" He said, "Well, I would do it, of course." He said, "Well, God has spoken to you. And he has said, I want you to live your life gloriously, radiantly, in an exemplary way, as a person who stutters." Wow, he said he didn't see that young man again for a long time. But when he did, he was preaching. Oh, not the way he had always intended. No, he was preaching to the deaf using sign language. And it didn't matter at all that he stuttered. It's amazing what God can do with our circumstances. So we don't want to let ourselves be angry and resentful no matter what it is. And another thing is that we don't want to let ourselves engage in self-pity. It's easy to do that. To just wrap the cloak of self-pity around us and say, "Oh, poor me, I'm a victim." And then we're useless also. You know, I heard that one man said, "I lost $5,000 in the stock market. $500,000 in the stock market." He said, "I am ruined. I'm disgraced." His friend said, "There's only one truth in what you just said. You did lose money in the stock market, but it's just your opinion that you're ruined and disgraced." It's the way we think about the things that happen to us that make a huge difference. One philosopher said, men are disturbed not so much by the things that happen to them, but by the way they think about the things that happen to them. A lot of truth in that. So it's so important for us to work on the way that we think about things, because that's what gets us into trouble. So we don't want to be resentful. We don't want to have a pity party. And we don't want to borrow trouble from tomorrow. So what do we want to do? How do we want to think when this adversity thing befalls us? We want to be a person who has already learned to look for and find and focus upon pleasant things. Look for, find, and focus upon pleasant things. Because what we're trying to do is make that a way that we normally think. To look at a person and see something good in it. Oh, the first thing you'll see is the wrong thing. So then you have to look for and find and focus on that good thing about them. You see how the little exercise goes? It is a little exercise, and it has to be tried again and again and again and again. And we can apply it to the circumstances, because even in the darkest times, there are still some positives there. Still some good things that you yet have, that you haven't lost everything. You still have something. Paul was teaching us to think that way in Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. And just think of all the circumstances in Paul's life. He wrote this when he was in prison. Think of that. Think how he could have found plenty of things bad to focus on. But no, he says that's not the way you do it. And so I submit to you, memorize this scripture. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think on such things. And he goes on to say that brings you peace. And I'm here to say it does. It does. But we won't do that unless we have practiced it. I had this little passage on my refrigerator a long time. But now it's in my heart. I don't have to have it on my refrigerator. But that's an exercise for us. And we can take this and walk out of this room and forget I ever said it, or you can work on it and make it who you are. And then when you have adversity, you know what? You will automatically, every once in a while, think, oh, God is so good. He's still doing this for me, and this, and this, and this, and this. You will look for, and you will find, and you will focus that there are blessings still there, even in that time of darkness. So it is well worth our effort. There's going to always be good out there, and there's going to always be evil. They'll probably be present at the same time. You get to find the good and focus on it. You have the power to do that. You just have to have the desire to do it. We get to choose. And we need to just store up the good little things and think about those. So when you're having a little worry moment, you can think, oh, no, I'm not going to think about that. I'm going to think about this good thing that happened that I remember. You know, I heard this story about a prisoner of war who said there wasn't much good to find in a prison camp during World War II, but he said we had to sleep out on the ground under the trees. And he said, you know, I finally realized that I had a wonderful time just lying under those trees looking up at the moon through those trees. And he said, I looked forward to that, and I kind of stored that memory, and I'd think about it all the next day, and I would look forward to the night so that I could watch that moon go through those trees. Now that's such a little thing. But if we store up our pleasant thoughts, we can focus on those in times when we're overcome by thoughts that we don't want to think. So what we want to do is just learn to think in other ways, to grow ourselves to be to overcome those unwanted changes that are going to come into our lives. Sooner or later, they're going to come. Unwanted changes. Now, we mentioned that natural fear of the unknown that we were talking about. And we do have that fear. We can also work on kind of overcoming that natural fear that's in us already. We can do that by making some choices. We can choose right now, while we're not being forced, to try a few new things, to change your routine. Go by choice to a new grocery store. It's going to take longer. You can't find your groceries there. But you know what? You'll be so uncomfortable, but you've practiced it now. You know how to be uncomfortable trying to find something in a different way. So you've had an experience. Go some new stores. Try to learn some new things. Don't just let yourself get so comfortable in that rut, because if you do, you're going to just grow that fear more and more and more. And when the change comes, it's going to be so hard for you. You know, I used to tell people, I practiced my own preaching about this. I learned to use the computer, and I was so proud of myself. And I'm still not a pro, but you know, I did learn that. And but now I really have a better story, because last summer my grandson wanted to go to foreign language school in Antigua, Guatemala. Well, he was 14, and my daughter and her husband didn't want him to go to a foreign country by himself. And so guess who got recruited to go with him? And not just to go. I enrolled in the class. And this is called total immersion. So what you do is you have a one-on-one teacher. No English is spoken. You have to stay in a Spanish-speaking home, and so you never get to speak your own language. Ooh. Now, there's a change for you. To live in a foreign culture, never speaking your own language. I was either speaking, you know, at our meals, if I had conversation with that family, I had to talk Spanish. And if I communicated with my teacher, I had to also. And then I was working on my homework in Spanish. So it was just Spanish, Spanish, Spanish. But you know what? It really works better to do it that way. And I'll tell you one thing, it got rid of some of that fear of the unknown. That's for sure. I should have grown a lot from that one. In fact, I guess it didn't undo me, though, because I'm scheduled to go back and do that again this summer. And I'm already gearing up. And you know, I'm not talking about 3 or 4 days here. I'm talking about a few weeks. And by the time you've lived in a different culture and spoken a different language a few weeks, well, that's a little stressful. So I'm not suggesting that you necessarily go quite that far. But do try something. Don't let yourself get away with just staying the same all the time. You'll be a lot more interesting person, too, if you just get out of your comfort zone once in a while and try some other things. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you the thing that really helped me the most when I was in my crisis. Because the thing that helped me really the most was that I had an uncanny ability to trust God. And I didn't know I was going to have that before I went in to it, but it was there. And I kid you not, there's nothing that unloads you quite so much from your burden as to be able to hand it to the Lord and say, whatever you're doing with this, I trust you. Now, it's kind of easy to say, I trust you. And you don't really know whether you're there yet or not until you're really in that circumstance. But when you're there, if you are able to, you will just find so much more peace than you ever would find any other way. Now, trust that really operates in a time like that it has to be a lot more than mere acknowledging the existence of God. It has to be a lot more than that. It has to be a lot more than going to church on Sunday morning, although that's a good thing to do. It's got to be more than those. It's got to be a relationship that's more like an ongoing dialogue, a prayerful dialogue with God. We've got to know each other. There are a lot of ways that happens. You know, when I think of that, I always think of Fiddler on the Roof, because I love Tevye, you know, who the main character in that, who had so many problems. And he had serious problems, but, you know, he had 5 daughters, and the father was supposed to pick who they married. Well, those girls were all marrying somebody he didn't pick. And besides that, Golda was bossing him around all the time. And besides that, his horse went lame. And he said, Lord, I know we're your chosen people, but do you have to choose us so often? So, you know, we're not going to trust somebody that we don't know. We're just not going to. So we better get to knowing God, that's for sure. Stay in the Word, because that's where we get to know Him. That's the only way we can really know Him. And read those relationships in the Old Testament. It really gives you some insight into how God deals with us. I notice that so many people, when they are struggling, turn to the book of Psalms. And I've often wondered, what is there about the book of Psalms precisely that draws the suffering ones? And I've about decided that it is the fact that David was able to trust God so much with his hardships. He had a lot of struggles in his life, but he trusted God with those. Now, how do I know that? Because remember when he went to the valley of Elah in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and he's trying to persuade King Saul to let him fight that giant? He starts telling King Saul about his life. And listen to what he has to say to King Saul. He says, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a bear or a lion came and carried off a sheep, I went after it. I struck it and rescued it from its mouth. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. Now listen to what else he says. The Lord who delivered me, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver us from that Philistine. You see who gets the credit here? He's been trusting God since he was just a little shepherd boy out in the fields. He's been practicing trusting God. He always credited God. Do we? Do we? I hope we do. I hope we're practicing that. You know, in Dallas, our highways are just wild and crazy. And I pray every day before I go out on the highways. And when I get there safely, I thank the Lord, because I know He had His shield around me, or I couldn't have made it through that mess of traffic that we have. So, yes, we need to practice every day, giving Him credit for our little victories as well as our big ones. But sometimes we just overlook our little ones and forget to credit Him with those. But see, David was just crediting God with his everyday victories. That's what we want to do, so that we have that kind of trust. You know, in Isaiah chapter 26, verse 3, it says, you will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast, because he trusts in you. Now listen to that. You will keep in perfect peace. Is that what we want when we're in trial? Exactly what we want. Okay. You will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast, because he trusts in you. You know, I don't claim to have arrived there, because the fact is, we're all at different places in our walk, but we're at different places within our own walk from time to time. There are probably times when I trust Him better than I do at other times. But oh, to the degree that I am able to trust Him, to that degree I will be able to have peace, and so will you. Now, I want you to know I am not saying here that we're pretending that we're not hurting when we lose a loved one, or when we have lost a job, or something painful happens to us. That would be denial. I am not suggesting that to us. We are hurting. But there's one more trait that I want us to look at before we close this session, and that is perseverance. So what I want us to see is, yes, we will be hurting, and we won't be denying that we're hurting. We're hurting. We're supposed to be hurting when those things happen to us. There's a difference between hurting and quitting. And perseverance is not quitting. It's saying, I'm suffering, yes, but I'm not quitting. Someone said recently that the greatest risk when we suffer a loss is not the risk of dying. It is the risk that we just stop living. There is a risk. When something terrible happens, sometimes people just stop living. They withdraw. They lose all purpose in their lives. They have no joy. And their life is just over as if they had died. But yet they're still living. Actually, Romans chapter 5, verse 3 tells us this is what's supposed to happen when we have struggles. It says, suffering produces perseverance. This trait that I'm talking about. These struggles that we have are intended to grow this perseverance, not cause us to stop living, but to keep hanging in there, tougher for the next time. To grow and be strengthened by that and not give up because of our adversities. Not to ever be willing to throw in the towel. So the thing is that I want to remind you of as we close this session is a little saying that I came across recently. And it goes like this. I may not set the world on fire, but when the Lord comes, may He find me still striking matches.